Last time we started working on a basic login system where we try to follow guidelines and best practices. We made the first basic API backend in Go and used PostgreSQL to set up a nice database. The problem we are facing now though is that no normal user actually can interact with it really. For that, we're now gonna start working on a web frontend for our login system. I'm Kandano from CodeD from Misbytes and welcome to Code Journey. I'm pretty much of a noob in web front-end development, and so I did some research. I wanted to try to make use of one of these web development frameworks like Angular, React or vue.js. After watching some crash courses on YouTube and some discussions with other developers, I decided to go with vue.js. Vue.js is a single-page web front-end framework that allows for easy implementation of, for example, the model view pattern. Those modern web dev frameworks utilize Node.js as a runtime environment to execute their tooling pipeline. With that said, we need to install it. Node.js also adds a package manager that allows for simple and easy dependency management. We're going to use Yarn for this purpose. So after installing Node and Yarn, we are going to install the Vue CLI globally on our system. And with it, we can boot the Vue UI via a shell command, with which we then create our project. After finding the correct folder and name, we change the package manager to be Yarn and that we don't want the beginner tips. We also make sure that a Git repository is created. In the next step, we select manual installation, so we can select the components we need ourselves. The additional packages we want are, for example, TypeScript, Progressive Web Application Support, Vue Router, and CSS preprocessors. Next, we're gonna select Vue 3 as our target Vue version. Use history mode for the router and Dart says a CSS preprocessor. After the project finally got created, I additionally installed jQuery and jQuery types. jQuery is a library that allows for adding easy and simple interactions and animations to your website. Now with the finished setup, I open the project in WebStorm and directly go to work. In the app.vue file, which is basically our main web page, I add a router link to the sign in and sign up page to the navigation menu, so we can debug it later on more easily. Now I started to create the base for our signup. So I created the Vue component that will represent the sign up box and a sign in sign up view. The views just hold the corresponding boxes for now. In this sign up box, I created some basic layout with title and a couple of input fields for email, name and password. To finish the box, I also added a button to submit the form. For debugging purposes, I also bound the button to a function to check if everything works as expected. Next up, I added the new views to the index.ts of the Vue router, so he's aware of those new views and their paths. Now that we got some base, before I continue with the functionality, I wanted to focus on the styling. So I used colors.co to create some color palettes I then gonna use in our project. Since we use Sass, I created a themes folder containing a base.scss file, which defines a couple of Sass variables for our color palette. After that, I began to create some base styling for some fundamental things like inputs and whatnot in the base.scss file. Now I wanted to check the looks, but well, it didn't work. The styling didn't get loaded. The problem was, we never told the pipeline to actually add our style to it. So I created the vue.config.js file in which we tell the tools to add our base style. After getting the base style up and running, I started to style the specific signup box itself. Since I'm pretty new to web front-end development, the styling process was quite some trial and error. And as a hint, when you research for information about all this, I highly recommend you to look up newer stuff. There is quite some old information out there which makes some stuff just way too difficult. Now with some proper styling of the input, I started to work on the UX. So basically, just on a script with jQuery that focused the next input field when you hit enter. After that, I finally started to work on some functionality for the sign-up process itself. I created a couple of reactive variables that will be bound to the input fields. And at this point I just decided to scrap the logic for the focus next field when return and replace it with some custom logic that will focus the next empty field in the input. This happens in the submit function, which always gets triggered when you hit return in one of the input fields or hit the submit button. And the actual submit logic only happens if all input fields actually have some data to process. To get references to the input fields so that I can focus them, I wanted to use a Vue internal functionality called refs instead of using jQuery. I then copied all of this over to the sign in. Since it has nearly the same functionality, I just removed the email field. Next step for me was to create some authentication logic to the router, so pages like a profile settings page are only accessible if you have authenticated yourself. Following with some major refactor, where I basically try to combine this sign up and sign in views into one, where you can switch between two tabs on the same view and still be able to refer to them by different routes, aka URLs. For this, I first of all needed to create the style and logic for the tab mechanism. Besides two router links to switch between them, I made a box which contains two other boxes the same size as the parent next to each other. And then, depending on a CSS class, I moved those two boxes to the left or right relatively to their original position. I also made it into a small CSS animation so we have some nice movement going on if you switch between those two. This seems to be the easiest solution in this specific case, without the need of much script nor dependencies. Next, I created in the view a unified reactive state object where I pass a reference to the two components, so that they share the same data. This allows for a nicer UX, like if you try to log in, but there is no corresponding account, you will then be able to just switch to the sign up page, which will then already have the same name and password like in the sign in box, so you only need to add your email to finish the sign up process. I also needed to add some script that the hidden box is completely hidden internally when out of view, so that, for example, the tab order ignores the hidden inputs. The script also responds to a change in the routing path so that the CSS class for the correct box is added and that the next empty input field in the form gets focused. Finally, after all the UX part, I started integrating the sign in and sign up logic. For this, I first of all needed to install Axios as dependency. This is a nice utility for more convenient work with HTTP requests. Next, I created a Vuex store and an auth module. This store and module from Vuex is essentially a nice framework to implement a global state machine for our website, like the current user login state. The module will try to load an authentication token at construction from the cookies and will store it. The state of our auth state machine is stored in a state field, which essentially lets us know if we are logged out, logged in, or are currently logging in. The module now provides some getters as well as some functions for controlling the state, like a function to log in. This function takes an email and a password and then executes an Axios call to our API to log in. While doing so, it returns a promise so that we can then respond in the UI accordingly if the sign-in worked or not. I also made the sign-in link with a v-if directive provided by vue.js to be only visible when we are not authenticated. So we basically added a rendering condition to our templated HTML via some sort of declarative syntax. Thank you, Vue.js. After a lot of trial and error, I finally got the login requests up and running. Now I started to try to implement the client side of our central universal error system, so that we can handle occurring errors from the API or page in a unified, simple way. I also added some sort of catch so that we can highlight the input fields red if something went wrong in the sign in or sign up procedure, like typing in an invalid email. And now, with some error handling, I finished our auth state with an logout action that simply clears the stored token, and so the state is recognized as logged out. I also added the signup request, this time directly in the signup box instead of the state, because signup probably only happens there and does not really affect the authentication state. If the signup was successful, I redirect the user then directly to the sign-in page. After fixing the router preprocessor for the authentication check, and cleaning up some code with TypeScript types, I implemented at last some UX features. Mainly that if you try to visit a page that requires authentication while not being authenticated, you will then get redirected to the sign in page with a redirect get query parameter that holds the target at which the site should redirect you automatically after you successfully have logged in. This query parameter also needs to be passed between the sign in and sign up routes so that the redirect works even if you haven't created an account yet. And everything that is left to say for now is I was Bruno from Code.d from Miswelts, and I say bye bye until next time, and as always, keep coding!